The Dark Scrolls. In the 12th century, beneath the cold arches of England's castles, where flickering torches cast shadows like ghosts against stone, a story unfolded that would outlive the kings who ruled and the queens who reigned. It was not merely a tale of politics or conquest, but of passion and vengeance, a drama so raw that centuries later it would still be whispered in chronicles and romanticized in legend. At its heart lay three figures: a king too reckless with his heart, a queen too proud to be humiliated, and a young woman whose beauty proved fatal. Henry II of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Rosamund Clifford did not set out to create a myth, yet their tangled lives gave Europe one of its most enduring scandals. Henry II was born into turbulence in 1133, the son of the Empress Matilda, whose claim to the English throne plunged the realm into civil war. By sheer force of will, cunning alliances, and unrelenting energy, Henry rose above the chaos, securing the crown in 1154 and founding the mighty Plantagenet dynasty. He was no ordinary monarch. Tireless in thought and restless in body, he reformed courts, extended royal authority, and built an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His mind was sharp, his ambition boundless, but his heart would prove to be his undoing. At his side stood Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman unlike any other in medieval Europe. Born in 1122, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, vast and wealthy, a prize that made her the most sought-after bride of her generation. First married to Louis VII of France, she had already worn a crown and ridden on crusade before she annulled that union and shocked Christendom by wedding Henry, 10 years her junior. Their marriage was a fusion of fire and power. With Eleanor's lands and Henry's drive, they ruled more territory than any monarch in Europe. She was not content to sit in silence. Eleanor was a duchess in her own right, a patron of troubadours, a leader of men, a queen whose beauty and intellect inspired awe and unease in equal measure. At first their bond seemed unbreakable, forged by mutual ambition and passion. Yet passion is a double-edged sword. The same fire that ignites love can just as easily consume it. As years passed, cracks began to show. Eleanor, older and unwilling to fade into the background, resisted Henry's attempts to dominate her as he dominated his lords. She had given him sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, each destined to play a role in the drama that followed. But she would not allow herself to be dismissed, and Henry, with his restless desires, began to look elsewhere for solace. Into this storm stepped Rosamund Clifford. Rosamund was no queen, no duchess, no princess of blood. She was the daughter of a Herefordshire noble, unremarkable by birth but extraordinary by beauty. Chroniclers called her the Fair Rosamund, and even centuries later poets would struggle to capture her loveliness. To Henry, she was not just a mistress. She was an escape, gentle and yielding where Eleanor was fierce and commanding. In Rosamund's arms he found what he thought was peace, though in truth it was fire disguised as comfort. For to love Rosamund was to challenge Eleanor, and Eleanor was not a woman to be challenged. Henry's devotion to Rosamund became reckless. Instead of discretion, he flaunted his passion by bringing her to Woodstock Palace, where, legend says, he constructed a labyrinth to hide her from the queen's eyes. Whether the maze was built of hedges, stone, or secrecy, its symbolism endured. A king who believed he could outwit fate, a mistress ensnared by both love and peril, and a queen who would not be deceived. For no labyrinth, however cunning, can contain the rage of a woman scorned. Eleanor discovered the affair, perhaps through spies, perhaps through intuition sharpened by years of court intrigue. To her, this was more than adultery. It was humiliation. She, who had once been Queen of France and now was Queen of England, the most powerful woman in Christendom, was mocked by a girl hidden in a maze. Betrayal cut deep, but pride cut deeper, and so the queen resolved to act. The scene that followed became legend. Eleanor entered the labyrinth, moving through its turns until she reached its heart, where Rosamund waited. The chroniclers differ on the details, but the legend is vivid. The queen confronting the mistress, presenting her with a dagger and a cup of poison, commanding her to choose death by blade or by drink. Whether Rosamund truly died by Eleanor's hand remains uncertain. Some say she was sent to a convent, others that she succumbed to illness. But history remembers not ambiguity, but drama. And so Rosamund became the maiden slain in the maze, Eleanor the avenger with poison and steel, and Henry the king who loved too recklessly. Rosamund was buried at Godstow Abbey near Oxford, her tomb adorned with flowers by those who pitied her fate. For a time she was revered almost as a saint of romance, until the Bishop of Lincoln declared it scandalous for a king's mistress to lie in holy ground. Her body was cast out, her bones disturbed, yet her memory grew stronger for it. The fair Rosamund was immortalized not by sanctity but by tragedy. Henry's grief did not heal his marriage. If he had hoped Eleanor might forgive, he misjudged her entirely. The queen withdrew from his side, retreating to Aquitaine and aligning herself with her sons. Pride and passion had cracked their union, and in the fissures rebellion took root. In 1173, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey rose in revolt against their father, spurred by their frustrations and by Eleanor's encouragement. She attempted to join them, but Henry captured her on her journey and confined her, first in England, then in various castles, for 16 long years. The queen, who once commanded armies, now lived behind stone walls, but her spirit was not broken. Henry fought to suppress the rebellions, but the damage was done. His family was fractured, his marriage destroyed, and the loyalty of his sons poisoned. The labyrinth at Woodstock was gone, but its shadow lingered, a reminder that the scandal of passion can shake even the strongest thrones. The rebellion of 1173 was more than the quarrel of sons against their father. It was the consequence of wounds left festering inside a family where loyalty had been eroded by suspicion. Eleanor, captured on her way to join her children, became Henry's prisoner, a queen silenced but not erased. Behind walls and iron gates she waited, her mind still sharp, her pride intact, and her influence reaching further than Henry cared to admit. For her sons did not forget her, nor did the barons who remembered her strength as Duchess of Aquitaine. While she lived, even in chains, she remained a symbol of resistance to Henry's tyranny. Henry, the young king, crowned in his father's lifetime, yet denied real power, grew restless and resentful. His name was king, but his authority was none. Richard, second son and Eleanor's heir in Aquitaine, bristled under his father's heavy hand, his fiery temper clashing with Henry's iron will. Geoffrey, clever and ambitious, spun intrigues in Brittany, always seeking an opening. And John, the youngest, spoiled by his father's favoritism, grew into a shadow that hovered uneasily over the rest. The Plantagenet sons were lions in a cage, pacing, snapping, longing for freedom, each encouraged by the memory of their mother's defiance. Henry crushed the rebellion with characteristic force, scattering armies, burning castles, and reasserting his supremacy. Yet his victory was hollow. Trust between father and sons had been broken beyond repair, and his imprisonment of Eleanor only deepened the chasm. Though outwardly triumphant, Henry's household was filled with tension, each meal, each counsel, each gesture poisoned by suspicion. The fair Rosamund was long dead, but her presence lingered, not in body but in consequence. For it was in betraying Eleanor with that doomed affair that Henry had set loose the storm which now consumed him. Years stretched on, and Eleanor endured captivity with a dignity that confounded her jailers. She was moved from castle to castle, kept under watch, permitted only occasional glimpses of the world beyond. Yet even confined, she remained formidable. Letters carried her voice, loyal Aquitanian lords remembered her favor, and her children carried her fire. When Henry paraded her at court on rare occasions, intending to show her subdued, it only reminded nobles that the Queen still lived, and with her the possibility of defiance still breathed. One by one, the children Henry and Eleanor had brought into the world became adversaries. The young king, dissatisfied and reckless, sought glory on foreign fields, raising mercenaries to challenge his father again. He pillaged shrines, burned villages, and played at war like a boy hungry for fame. But in 1183, his body betrayed him. Struck with fever, he lay dying, far from triumph. In desperation, he begged his father's forgiveness, but Henry, weary of betrayal, sent only words, not presents. The young king died alone, his short reign an empty crown, leaving behind nothing but debts and grief. Henry wept, but the tears were bitter, for he knew he had loved his eldest son too little and feared his other sons too much. Richard inherited his brother's role as heir, yet his bond with Henry was even more strained. Fierce, proud, and merciless in war, Richard was every bit his mother's son. He ruled Aquitaine with a heavy hand, clashing with barons and bishops alike. Henry sought to curtail his power, favoring John, the youngest, with lands and promises. This favoritism stoked Richard's fury, and Eleanor's voice, though caged, urged him to stand firm against his father. Geoffrey, meanwhile, carved his own path in Brittany, cunning and ambitious, always seeking advantage in the endless family struggle. It seemed that in the Plantagenet brood, blood bound them less than rivalry, and each day tightened the web of resentment that choked their dynasty. Henry himself, though still vigorous, grew older. His red hair streaked with gray, his eyes weary from years of battlefields and councils. He was a man haunted by the betrayal of his sons, by the cold distance of his wife, by the memory of a mistress whose grave could not be honored without scandal. For all his conquests, he was a husband who had lost his queen, a father who had lost his son's love, a king who had lost his peace. In 1186, Geoffrey too was gone, trampled in a tournament in Paris. His death, violent and senseless, robbed Henry of another son and left a young boy, Arthur of Brittany, as heir to Geoffrey's line. The family tree, once so vigorous, seemed cursed, its branches withering one by one. Richard now stood as Henry's greatest rival, not just as heir, but as opponent, his ambitions fanned by Eleanor's encouragement. The old king turned increasingly to John, but John was unsteady, cunning in whispers, yet clumsy in action, distrusted by all but his father. By 1189, the war between father and sons could no longer be contained. Richard allied with Philip Augustus of France, pressing hard against Henry's lands. Betrayal circled the king like wolves, each ally turning, each son bartering loyalty for advantage. In the heat of summer, worn and ill, Henry retreated to Chinon. There, broken in body and spirit, he received the final blow. A list of his enemies, and among them, to his horror, the name of John, his youngest, his favorite. The betrayal of the son he had trusted most shattered what little strength remained in him. Within days, Henry lay dying, abandoned by all but a few loyal servants. His final words, bitter and weary, were a plea to God for mercy. Henry II, once the fiery founder of the Plantagenet Empire, was gone. He left behind not a united dynasty, but a family fractured, a wife who had outlived his power, and a legacy forever tainted by scandal. Eleanor, released at last by his death, stepped from captivity into freedom. At nearly 70, her hair silver but her presence undiminished, she strode once more into the halls of power, her eyes set not on the past but on the future. Yet, even as she resumed command of her duchy and guided her surviving sons, the labyrinth of Woodstock lingered in memory. For it was there that Henry's reckless passion had broken her pride, there that a young woman had died, and there that the seeds of rebellion had been sown. The queen who had been prisoner was queen again, and Europe would soon learn that Eleanor of Aquitaine was not done shaping history. When the bells of Chinon tolled to announce the death of Henry II, the air seemed lighter for those who had long been bound by his shadow. Among them was Eleanor of Aquitaine, emerging from the long night of her imprisonment. 16 years of confinement had not broken her. If anything, they had tempered her, like steel beaten under the hammer. She stepped once more into freedom with a dignity that astonished even her enemies. Age had silvered her hair and lined her face, but her spirit shone undimmed, and her return to power was nothing less than a rebirth. Richard, now king, did not fear her influence as his father had. To him, Eleanor was not a rival but an ally, the mother who had shaped his courage and sharpened his will. Their bond was unlike the cold hostility that had defined her marriage with Henry. Richard trusted her, perhaps because he saw in her a reflection of his own unyielding nature. And so, when he prepared to depart on crusade, his thoughts turned not to silencing her, but to elevating her. Eleanor became regent of England, guardian of the throne, ruler in her son's absence. It was a role she wore naturally, as if the years of captivity had never existed. She traveled ceaselessly across England and Aquitaine, her presence commanding respect. Barons who might have risen in rebellion thought twice before challenging her authority. She summoned councils, negotiated truces, collected revenues, and enforced loyalty. Chroniclers who once wrote of her beauty now marveled at her endurance. At nearly 70, she was indefatigable, riding long distances, her body frail but her will unbent. Where Richard's strength lay in battle, Eleanor's lay in governance. Together, though far apart, they embodied the dual heart of the Plantagenet realm. Richard's departure for the Holy Land left England vulnerable, and John, his youngest brother, could not resist the lure of power. Ambitious and restless, John plotted with Philip Augustus of France, hoping to seize the crown in Richard's absence. But Eleanor was no idle regent. She watched, calculated, and acted with precision. When John's conspiracies threatened to unravel the kingdom, she moved swiftly, rallying support for Richard, quelling dissent, and reminding the barons that the blood of Aquitaine still commanded loyalty. John, for all his scheming, was no match for his mother's experience. Each time he grasped for the throne, Eleanor's hand was there to push him back into line. The greatest test came not from John's betrayal, but from Richard's capture. Returning from the crusade in 1192, the king was seized by Leopold of Austria and later held for ransom by the emperor. It was a calamity that could have broken England. The ransom demanded was staggering, 150,000 marks, more than double the kingdom's annual income. Many despaired that Richard would never return. Yet Eleanor, nearly 80, refused despair. She took it upon herself to raise the sum, traveling across her lands, extracting contributions, appealing to bishops, lords, and towns alike. Chroniclers describe her riding in bitter cold, her white hair covered by a simple veil, her presence both regal and maternal. It was she who negotiated with emperors, who pleaded with abbots, who demanded from barons. She spoke not only as Queen Mother, but as the embodiment of loyalty itself. Her words carried the weight of sacrifice, for she had endured betrayal, captivity, and loss, and still she stood unbroken. When the ransom was at last gathered and delivered, it was Eleanor's triumph as much as Richard's salvation. The king returned to his realm because his mother had refused to let him be forgotten. Yet the years of Eleanor's regency were not only about loyalty and endurance, they were also years of memory. For though she ruled wisely, she could not escape the ghosts of her past. Each time she quashed John's ambitions, she must have remembered the bitterness that had consumed her own marriage, how a king's favoritism for his youngest child had poisoned the family. Each time she sat in council, she must have recalled Henry's counsels, where suspicion hung heavy and trust was a stranger. And perhaps, in the quiet of her chambers, when the duties of the day were done, the labyrinth at Woodstock returned to her mind, the moment when pride and betrayal collided, and Rosamund Clifford's fate sealed the doom of her marriage. Richard's reign, though filled with victories, was short. His passion for war never waned, and in 1199 he met his end at Chalus, struck by an arrow during a siege. Eleanor, nearly 80, bore the grief with the stoicism of a woman who had buried too many of her children already. She arranged his burial at Fontevraud, beside Henry, the husband she had once loved and hated, and near her own effigy that would one day lie in stone beside them both. Richard's death left the crown to John. The son she trusted least yet was bound to support, and so Eleanor, frail in body but still fierce in will, set out once more to secure the dynasty. She rode into Aquitaine to ensure loyalty, negotiated with nobles who eyed rebellion, and worked to stabilize John's succession. Chroniclers marveled that a woman of such age could still endure such journeys, but Eleanor seemed to draw strength from the very act of defiance against time itself. She had outlived Henry, Rosamund, 3 of her sons, and countless enemies. She had seen empires rise and fall, crusades launched and lost, and yet she remained a living bridge between generations. Her later years were spent largely at Fontevraud Abbey, where she finally allowed herself moments of rest. Yet, even there, she was not idle. She continued to advise John, mediated disputes among her grandchildren, and served as a symbol of continuity in a world ever shifting. In 1204, at the age of around 82, Eleanor of Aquitaine died. She was laid to rest at Fontevraud, her effigy carved with a book in her hands, as though she were still reading, still learning, still guiding. In death, she was united once more with Henry, lying side by side in stone. To those who knew the legend, the irony was striking. The king who betrayed, the queen who avenged, resting together in eternal silence. Richard lay nearby, the warrior son who carried both their fire. Rosamund, far away, lay scattered, her tomb desecrated, her memory kept alive not by stone but by song. And yet, in the imagination of later generations, they were all part of the same story, bound together in the labyrinth of history. When Richard the Lionheart's body was lowered into the earth in 1199, the Plantagenet crown passed to the last surviving son of Henry and Eleanor, John. For Eleanor, who had lived to see more than 80 years, it was a final test of endurance. She had secured his succession, ridden across her duchy one last time to rally lords to his cause, and then withdrawn at last to Fontevraud. Her passing in 1204 left John alone at the helm of an empire already beginning to fracture. Without her steady hand, the weaknesses of her youngest son quickly became visible. John was clever but untrustworthy, perceptive yet indecisive. He inherited none of Richard's brilliance in battle, nor Henry's relentless energy, nor Eleanor's charisma. What he did inherit, perhaps, was the suspicion and bitterness that had poisoned his family for decades. He distrusted his barons, quarreled with his nobles, and alienated allies with impulsive decisions. The vast Angevin empire his father had assembled, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, slipped away piece by piece during his reign. The greatest blow came in 1204, the very year of Eleanor's death, when John lost Normandy to Philip Augustus of France. The duchy that had been the cradle of the Plantagenets was gone, and with it the foundation of their continental power. Aquitaine, once Eleanor's proud inheritance, trembled on the edge of rebellion, while Anjou and Touraine collapsed into French hands. Within 5 years of Eleanor's burial, the empire she and Henry had built through ambition, marriage, and conquest was dismantled. To many it seemed a curse had fallen upon John, as though the sins of his parents had ripened into judgment. The court of John lacked the grandeur of his predecessors. Where Henry had filled his halls with councils of law, and Eleanor with troubadours, John filled them with mistrust. His temper was quick, his punishments cruel, his taxes crushing. He quarreled with the church, defied the pope, and drove his barons to despair. The memory of past Plantagenet scandals resurfaced in whispers. Had not Henry betrayed Eleanor for Rosamund? Had not Eleanor risen against her husband? Had not their sons rebelled against their father? Was it any wonder, then, that John inherited a kingdom soaked in distrust? The labyrinth of Woodstock, though long dismantled, seemed to linger as a metaphor, a maze of secrets and betrayals from which no Plantagenet could escape. In 1215, John's failures culminated in open rebellion. The barons, weary of his broken promises and arbitrary rule, confronted him at Runnymede. There, beside the Thames, he was forced to seal Magna Carta, a charter that bound the crown to law, limited royal power, and enshrined rights that would echo through centuries. It was a humiliation for a king who believed himself master of all, a humiliation born from arrogance, much as his father's had been. John raged against it, sought to annul it, but the moment was irreversible. In the eyes of history, he became the king who bowed to his barons, the monarch broken by his own pride. To the people of England, the story of Rosamund was still alive in song and tale. Her beauty, her secret love, her tragic death haunted the imagination, and many linked the decline of the Plantagenets to that original sin of passion and betrayal. They whispered that the vengeance Eleanor had taken in Woodstock had poisoned her house, that the blood spilled there had cursed her descendants. John, unloved and distrusted, seemed the living embodiment of that curse, the last heir of a marriage built on fire and destroyed by jealousy. John's reign ended in misery. Defeated by Philip of France at Bouvines in 1214, his hopes of regaining Normandy collapsed. His health declined, his barons rebelled again, and in 1216 he died, sick and abandoned, much as his father had. He left the crown to his 9-year-old son, Henry III, a child too young to rule, a kingdom too divided to stand strong. Thus, the dynasty limped on, but its glory had faded. And yet, the legend of Woodstock did not fade. As monks copied chronicles and minstrels sang in halls, the triangle of Henry, Eleanor, and Rosamund became more than history. It became explanation. Why had the Plantagenets been so cursed with betrayal? Why had fathers warred with sons, brothers with brothers, kings with their barons? The answer, many believed, lay not in politics but in passion, in a labyrinth where a king's desire, a queen's wrath, and a mistress's death set loose a storm that would rage for generations. By the 13th century, Rosamund's story was retold with variations. In some versions she was innocent, a maiden forced into a king's bed, her only crime her beauty. In others she was temptress, luring Henry into sin and paying with her life. Eleanor was cast sometimes as murderer, sometimes as wronged wife defending her dignity. Henry was painted as reckless lover or cruel tyrant. Each retelling reshaped the legend, but always the core remained. Love turned to tragedy, pride turned to vengeance, and a dynasty undone by its own heart. Thus, as Magna Carta was copied onto parchment and carried across shires, as John's name became a curse among peasants and nobles alike, the story of Rosamund was still spoken, a reminder that behind the grand battles and charters lay human weakness, The labyrinth of Woodstock, once built for secrecy, had become a labyrinth of memory, winding through England's imagination, impossible to escape. Centuries rolled on, kings rose and fell, and the Plantagenet name gave way to Lancasters and Yorks, to Tudors and Stuarts. Yet the story of Henry, Eleanor, and Rosamund endured. Castles crumbled, parchments decayed, but the tale of the labyrinth at Woodstock remained alive, passed from lips to lips, inked into chronicles, embroidered in poems. For while battles are fought and forgotten, the passions of the heart never cease to move those who hear them. Rosamund Clifford, who in life had been little more than a young noblewoman caught in a king's desire, became in death a symbol. Minstrels sang of her golden hair and gentle eyes, of her innocence lost and her fate sealed by a queen's wrath. In some ballads she was pure as a saint, in others a tragic temptress, but always she was fair, Rosamund, the maiden in the maze. Her tomb at Godstow, stripped of sanctity by a bishop who declared her unworthy of holy ground, only fed the legend further. Lovers visited, pilgrims left flowers, and long after her bones were scattered, her name lingered like perfume in the memory of England. Eleanor of Aquitaine, too, grew in myth. Chroniclers remembered her not just as Duchess and Queen, but as the formidable woman who dared to confront a rival in secrecy. Some condemned her as murderess, others praised her as wronged wife, but all agreed she was no ordinary queen. Later ages romanticized her, painting her as both patron of courts of love and avenger of her dignity. Her effigy at Fontevraud, lying serenely with a book in her hands, became a contradiction. In stone, a woman of wisdom and peace. In legend, the queen with dagger and poison, unyielding, proud, eternal. Henry II's legacy, meanwhile, was rewritten through the lens of his heart. His achievements in law and governance, his reforms that shaped English justice for centuries, often stood in the shadow of his scandal. To many, he was the king who built a labyrinth not of law but of passion, who believed he could command even the secrecy of desire, and discovered instead that no king is master of his own heart. His empire, vast and unprecedented, was remembered alongside the tale of its unraveling, and that unraveling was forever linked with Woodstock. During the Renaissance, poets and playwrights revived the legend with renewed vigor. Thomas Deloney sang of Rosamund's beauty, Samuel Daniel wove her into verse, painters placed her in flowing gowns amid green mazes, and dramatists hinted at her story in tragedies of love and revenge. Even in Shakespeare's England, the labyrinth of Woodstock was a familiar symbol. It spoke to the dangers of unchecked passion, the inevitability of jealousy, the futility of trying to conceal desire in walls and corridors. Audiences who had never seen the palace itself could imagine the queen walking its turns, the mistress trembling at its center, the king blind to the storm he had unleashed. The tale was more than entertainment. It was moral, political, and cultural memory. It reminded listeners that kings were human, vulnerable not only to sword and spear, but to longing and betrayal. It suggested that the greatest empires could be undone not by foreign foes, but by secrets whispered in darkened halls, and it warned that pride, when wounded, could be more destructive than any army. In this way, the story transcended its time, becoming a parable for generations. By the Victorian age, when medieval romance was rediscovered with fervor, Rosamund's legend bloomed anew. Painters depicted her in pre-Raphaelite splendor, fragile and luminous, her beauty almost otherworldly. Eleanor appeared as dark counterpart, fierce and unbending, her jealousy dramatized as both crime and justice. To an age fascinated by both morality and passion, the story offered irresistible contrasts: innocence and vengeance, love and betrayal, beauty and death. It was retold in novels, in poems, in histories, half factual, half imagined, until Rosamund and Eleanor were as much myth as memory. And so it remains today. Tourists who wander the quiet ruins of Woodstock, where only fragments of walls remain, still hear the echo of the tale. Guides speak of the maze that no longer exists, of the secret love that once burned there, of the Queen's vengeance that turned passion into tragedy. Fontevraud Abbey, where Henry and Eleanor lie in stone, receives visitors who look upon their effigies and recall not only their power but their scandal. The story lingers because it touches something eternal, the knowledge that even those who seem untouchable can be undone by the heart. The triangle of Henry, Eleanor, and Rosamund is not remembered for its politics, though politics shaped kingdoms. It is remembered because it is human. It is the story of a man who wanted too much, a woman who would not be diminished, and another who was caught between them. It is the story of how desire can blind, how pride can harden, and how vengeance can change the course of history. And it is the story of how one moment in a labyrinth, whether fact or legend, can echo through centuries, transforming people into archetypes and events into myth. Henry is remembered as the restless king who built an empire but could not govern his heart. Eleanor is remembered as the queen who shaped dynasties and defied captivity, but also as the woman whose wrath became legend. Rosamund is remembered as the fair maid whose beauty doomed her, immortalized not by crown or achievement, but by tragedy. Together they form a story that belongs not only to England, but to the world. A reminder that history is never only about power, but about people with all their flaws, passions, and wounds. And so, as the centuries fade and names of battles are forgotten, the labyrinth of Woodstock remains, not in stone, but in memory. In its turns, we still see the king searching for solace, the queen seeking vengeance, and the maiden awaiting her fate. We hear the clash of pride and desire, the silence of betrayal, the echo of choices that shaped a dynasty. It is a labyrinth we cannot leave, for it is built not of hedges or walls, but of the human heart itself. And in that heart, Henry, Eleanor, and Rosamund walk still, bound forever in a story that outlived them all. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.